Hello and welcome to today's seminar. My name is Mikael Witteblad and I'm the head of the research program here at SNS. This seminar is part of our collaboration with the Institute for International Economic Studies, IIES, at Stockholm University, through which we aim to bring insights from leading international economists to the Swedish policy debate. Today, Uta Schönberg, Research Fellow at the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at University of College London, will present her research on economics and politics of refugee migration to the European Union. And with us today, we also have Joakim Palme from Uppsala University and the Migration Studies Delegation, and Daniel Sjöberg, Policy Advisor to Cecilia Wikström, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Swedish Liberal Party. So welcome to all of you. The seminar is moderated by Agneta Berge from IIES. So before I hand over to you, Agneta, I will just remind everyone that you're welcome to share what is said here today on social media. And if you would like to do so, please use the hashtag SNS kunskap. So the floor is yours, Agneta.
Great. Thank you. Hi. So, like Mikael said, I am Agneta Berge, a PhD student at the IIES, and I'm very happy to be here today to moderate this seminar, which I think will be extremely interesting. And we have a great lineup, like Mikael has already mentioned. So, first of all, we will hear Uta Schönberg, who is a professor of economics at UCL and also the Deputy Director of the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at the UCL, to present her research on refugee migration to the EU for about 20 minutes. Then Joakim Palme, who is a Professor of Political Science at Uppsala University and Chair of Delmi, the Migration Studies Delegation, has 10 minutes to comment from an academic point of view. And lastly, Daniel Sjöberg, who is a Policy Advisor to Cecilia Wikström in the European Parliament for the Swedish Liberal Party and currently working on a revised Dublin regulation, will give a more policy perspective on this topic for also some 10 minutes. And finally, we will gather all three here for a panel discussion at the end. And if there is time as we go along, there might be room for a question after each presentation. But in principle, we will make room for a lot of audience questions at the end during the panel discussion. And then at 11:15, we end here. So with this, I welcome you up, Uta Schönberg.
Invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So my presentation today will summarize some work I have done with Christian Dustmann, Francesco Fasani, Tommaso Frattini and Luigi Minale, published in the Economic Policy. So according to the UN Refugee Agency, according to the UN Refugee Agency, in 2015, individuals with forced displacement exceeded 60 million for the first time. This number actually now has increased to 71 million. But already in 2015, 1 in 122 individuals in the world have been forced to flee their homes. I do not need to remind you here that this became a major challenge for Europe. It became one of the key political issues of EU member states and the EU as a whole. So what I plan to do today is to shed some light on this debate by providing information, by giving you some hopefully interesting facts, and also by providing you some economic insights. So let me start with reviewing the key legislation, the 1951 Geneva Convention for Refugees and its 1967 amendment, which as of April 2015 has been signed by 145 or 142 countries in the world. So the Geneva Convention is based on the concept of individual persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political opinion, but it does not directly address civilians fleeing war or civilian or conflicts more generally, which of course was an important part of the past refugee crisis. The Geneva Convention, however, includes what is called the non-refoulement clause, and according to this clause, an applicant cannot be returned where his life or freedom is threatened, even if his refugee status was not successful. So this non-refoulement clause then leads to temporary or subsidiary humanitarian protection, a point I will come back to later in this presentation. So who then is a refugee? So starting with the population of concerns, these are individuals who have fled or are fleeing violence, persecutions, or war. So many of these individuals will be internally displaced, so they will be still in their country of origin. Some then move to neighboring countries. And among those, some will then move to Geneva Convention countries. Think of that as OECD countries, where they then can apply for asylum. So to give you some numbers here, the population of concern, this in 2015 was 60 million, as I've already highlighted. This number is growing day by day. Out of these 16 million out of the 60 million have moved on to neighboring countries. And a bit more than 2 million have actually applied for asylum. So that's the first point to keep in mind. The asylum seekers we in Europe mostly talk about, they are a relatively small share of the refugee population as a whole, and they're a very small share of the population of concern. So this table here provides you with some evidence on where refugees are coming from and in which continent they are then actually hosted. So the first point to take away from this table is that most refugees from Africa actually remain in Africa. The same for Asia, the same for the Americas. Out of the 16 million refugees in the world in 2015, Europe hosted 14.7%. So this is perhaps a smaller share than many of you would have thought. So here are the numbers for Syrians. Syrians, of course, made up a large share of the asylum seekers in 2015 and in the past years. So prior to the conflict, Syria had a population of about 22 million. Among those, more than half were actually displaced, 12 million. Among those displaced, more than half, 6.5 million, are internally displaced. So they are still in Syria. Only a very small share has been offered resettlement. And around 5 million have left Syria. So where did these Syrians who have left the country go to? 90% are actually in neighboring countries. Most importantly, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So there are now 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon has a population of a bit more than 4 million. So as of 2015, roughly 1 in 4 individuals in Lebanon was actually a Syrian refugee. So what about Syrians then in Europe? Out of the roughly 5 million refugees and asylum seekers, only 9.6% actually went to Europe and applied for asylum. Of those, Germany and Sweden have admitted most refugees. Germany, of course, is a much larger country than Sweden. So per capita, Sweden was the country that admitted the most Syrian refugees. But please bear in mind, this is still a small number compared to the population of concern. So this table here then provides you with some information on asylum recognition rates. These statistics refer to the first instance. And what you can see is that these recognition rates, they vary across time. There's also a lot of variation across countries. But what is very clear is that many asylum applications, at least at first instance, are not successful. So roughly about half of asylum applications are rejected, at least in the first round. Another point that it's important to bear in mind. So part of the reason why these asylum recognition rates vary across years and also across countries has to do with where asylum seekers actually come from. Asylum seekers from Syria had very high recognition rates, exceeding 90% in pretty much all countries. Recognition rates for asylum seekers from Afghanistan and Iraq have been lower. So another point worth highlighting is whether countries have given permanent or temporary status to these asylum seekers. So in the case of Syria, most Syrians have fled Syria because of civil war and conflict. So countries may give these Syrians either the permanent Geneva status or a temporary status, which would mean that Syrians can stay in the country only as long as the war is going on. Once Syria is considered to be safe again, they would then have to go back. So countries have taken very different routes here. So Germany has mostly given full Geneva status to the Syrian asylum applicants. Sweden, on the other hand, has mostly given temporary status only to the Syrian applicants. I'm sure you all know the inflow of asylum seekers has been decreasing. At the peak of the crisis, there were in the fall of 2015, there were 160,000 applications in the EU per month. This has now declined to about 40,000. So let me provide you with some evidence on the labor market integration of refugees. So here it's worth talking again about the possible distinction between economic migrants and refugee migrants. Of course, this distinction is blurred. There is a gray zone here. But nevertheless, economic migrants have more choice. So they have more choice in deciding whether to migrate, yes or not, and also to which country to migrate to. And this decision is mostly based on economic considerations. Refugee migrants, on the other hand, respond to external events. And for that reason, it is very likely that refugees have lower success in the labor market, find it more difficult to integrate into the labor market than economic migrants, even if otherwise they're very similar. So another point that's worth mentioning here is that whether a refugee is given the permanent or the temporary status, well, this could affect the refugee's success in the labor market. So what I have in mind here is that integrating in the labor market or the society as a whole, it requires investments, such as learning the language. We all know learning a language is very hard work and is very difficult. Now, a refugee that believes he is allowed to stay in the country for only 2 or 3 years, or his status in general is quite uncertain, well, the incentives of undertaking these very costly investments for this refugee given temporary status may be different, or likely to be different from the refugee who's given permanent status and expects to be in the country for the rest of his life. So it's very hard to find good data on refugees, at least for Europe as a whole. We have used here the 2008 European Labour Force Survey. So it's a cross-section I'm talking about. The data I'm showing you refers to 14 EU countries. And in these countries, migrants or respondents have to first asked, well, did you migrate and why did you migrate? for the statistics I'm going to show you, a refugee is someone who says he's in the country because of international protection. So, according to this data, in these 14 EU countries, refugees make up 6.4% of the foreign-born population and about 0.7% of the total population. Refugees are more likely to be male, they're younger, and they're somewhat less educated than the economic migrants. So this figure here shows you employment differentials between economic migrants from EU 15 countries, here, from economic migrants outside EU 15 countries, that's here, and then for refugees or asylum seekers. The blue lines refer to the unconditional employment gaps. The orange bars refer to conditional gaps, conditional on age, education, and gender. So indeed what you can see is that employment gaps between natives and refugees are quite a bit larger than employment gaps between economic migrants and refugees. Unconditionally, in 2008, refugees were about 16 percentage points less likely to be in employment than natives. So in this figure here, we've broken down these employment gaps for refugees based on their country of origin. So one thing that's worth highlighting here is that employment gaps tend to be larger for refugees coming from Northern Africa and the Middle East compared to refugees from Europe. Okay, so this is of course also exactly where the past refugees, the Syrians, etc., have come from. There's also some more positive news because there is some evidence that refugees succeed in catching up with natives. So these employment gaps decline the more time the refugees spend in the country. But the caveat here, this is identified from a cross-section. So what is next? You may think asylum applications have gone down, so maybe we can relax and sit back. I very much would like to argue, no, we cannot do that. What I really want to emphasize here is the migration pressure is not going away. In fact, population of Africa is predicted to increase from currently 1.1 billion to 2.8 billion over the next 45 years. And at the same time, among the 20 countries ranked highest according to the 2016 Fragile State Index, 14 are located in Africa and 3 in the Middle East. There is no doubt that Europe will be more affected by these developments than the United States and Canada, simply because of our geographical location. The past refugee crisis has taught us the 1990 Dublin Convention, the current regulatory framework does not work. So what we propose here is actually a new framework that ideally should be based on 2 pillars. First pillar is a coordinated policy that secures Europe's, or at least the EU's, outer borders, and ideally deals with asylum claims before refugees have crossed into mainland Europe. And the second pillar would be some kind of allocation mechanism that more equitably distributes the burden of refugee migration across countries, but also takes into account national particularities. I do not need to tell you here that implementing such a policy is incredibly challenging, and it requires countries to compromise on a key sovereignty issue: who should be allowed to live within member states' borders. But what I want to do now, at the end of my talk, is to highlight the economic advantages of such a policy. So there are clear economic advantages. So it is possible that such a coordinated policy actually makes all countries better off. So what are these economic reasons in favor of such a coordinated solution? Well, let's look at the system we have right now. So men and women spend their lifetime savings and often more to then take a very risky journey to mainland Europe. They hand a lot of money over to smugglers. Once in mainland Europe, with a fairly high probability, their asylum application gets rejected. We can all agree that this is not an ideal system. So making decisions before asylum seekers have actually made it to mainland Europe, well, first avoids deportation costs. Smugglers immediately would go out of business. Individuals are not forced to make risky journeys. And ultimately, economic migrants, whose chances of success for asylum are slim, have little incentive to actually apply. The second advantage of a coordinated policy is, well, it allows us to keep the inner European borders open, which has been the case since Schengen. And there are clear economic advantages from having open borders and limited controls at the borders. And third, refugee status is essentially what economists call a public good. So by that, I mean, if one country provides protection to an individual who has fled civil war or violence or persecution, well, then other countries benefit from that as well, because these other countries now know this individual is safe. He or she no longer is in danger. At the same time, it's the country who is hosting the asylum applicant who bears the full cost. So this means that individually, if each country makes decisions individually, we will have an under-provision of this public good, refugee status, which can be corrected if we instead decide at the European level about the refugee status. And finally, this coordinated European policy would avoid or would encourage what I call here dynamically consistent decisions. So what do I mean by that? Once these asylum seekers are in the country, it's in the best interest of the country to implement policies that foster the labor market success of the asylum seekers, such that actually allowing them to work, making decisions on their applications swiftly, and possibly also more active programs such as language programs, etc. Okay? Yet very many countries have implemented policies that hinder the success of refugees in the labor market. So many countries take a very long time to make decisions. They restrict asylum seekers from working. And the reason why they have done this is actually to deter applications to their own country. Yeah, so once we have a European solution, well, this would eliminate this possible trade-off between deterrence on the one hand and encouraging labor market success of refugees on the other hand. And so let me conclude with once again emphasizing the migration pressure is not going away. Hopefully, Europe will be better prepared when the next crisis is coming, and we really should use this opportunity to work towards a European solution. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I will just ask a first question, and then we can have time for one audience questions, I think. From your research and from your knowledge of the research, what seems to be the most important integration mechanism for these refugees in the different countries to improve their labor market attachment?
Should I switch off? Okay. My co-authors, Tommaso Frattini, Luigi Minale, and Francesco Fasani, actually have investigated exactly this question, and they quite convincingly show that restricting refugees from the labor market early on is quite harmful to their success later on in the labor market.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Do we have a yes, John?
So it's impossible to disagree with your statement that we should think of the refugee system as a public good at the EU level. But it's also clear to me that it's a public good that seems to have different value in different states, right? But we have theories about how to deal with public goods that have different values to different individuals. And to me, it seems that there is too much focus on burden sharing, which is kind of a different thing, right? And the fairness in burden sharing. And would it be possible to kind of to think of a pan-European system of this where you don't emphasize so much burden sharing? So those countries that think this is a valuable public good take a bigger share.
Yeah, and a very good point. I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think. In the past, European efforts probably have focused indeed too much on this burden sharing. So what I try to do here at the end is precisely to emphasize the gains from a European solution as well. Yeah, and you are of course also very, very right that the value of this public good differs across EU countries, and that is also one reason why it is difficult to come up with the European solution.
So we can have room for one more question here. Wait for the mic coming.
Susanne Palme, Swedish Radio. Can you say anything about the costs of this refugee immigration to Europe?
So looking at the integration success of refugees, just looking at the past waves of refugee migration, yes, we have probably to prepare us that the refugees who arrived in the past 3 years will have lower employment rates than natives. But these costs very much depend also on the policies that countries decide to implement. So, and that's an important point to keep in mind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome Joakim Palme.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a huge challenge to comment on not only this presentation, but also a rich paper that I was able to read and start to digest before today. And I would like to thank Uta for both the presentation, the paper. It contributes with a broad overview of a very complicated area, and both when it comes to the rules that govern refugee-related migration and a number of the economic issues that we can associate with refugee migration in Europe in the past, but also that it points to the fact that we should not only look backwards but also ahead and identify that there are strong pressures for future refugee migration stemming from the conflict-ridden African continent, but presumably also other kinds of migration that will or will not appear as part of what we now talk about as the sort of regime for dealing with asylum migration, namely the Geneva Convention. My second point is that, while this is a good and overview and insightful analysis, there's also in the paper a bit kind of alarmist flavor of. You can read this in different ways, but one way of reading it is that this is a real crisis. And I mean, from an economic perspective, it's hard to see that the refugee crisis in 2015 or the elevated number of asylum seekers that have come to Europe in the past decades has been a real economic crisis. the costs have been manageable and not on par of what was in the contribution of the global financial crisis. So I think we should recognize that if we take the pressure of asylum seekers to the European continent, it's manageable numbers, and this has been pointed out by the present Secretary General of the United Nations, with the past as boss of the UNHCR. This, of course, does not mean that there aren't very important economic issues around asylum migration, and I think the paper does a good job in reporting on the broad results here when it comes to labor market integration in Europe, and I think we can show Swedish numbers that sort of mirror this broad picture of a very slow integration of asylum seekers and refugees on the Swedish labor market. What has been striking to me, and this also counts for not the cross-sectional data, but for over time data following different cohorts of asylum seekers, is that the pattern has been remarkably stable. Since the 1990s, we've seen that it takes about 15 years for a new cohort to reach sort of normal labor force attachment levels, even if it's not reaching the very high Swedish employment levels that are sort of 20% higher. And that we see different policy attempts to sort of speed up this process, and there might be some indications that these policies work, but it also turns out that the process seems to be dependent on the macroeconomic development. So we see that in periods where we have high unemployment, it goes slower, and in periods with a high demand on labor, it goes faster, and it goes a lot faster, and it goes also faster for the group that you pointed to, namely those who come from outside the European continent. So we should recognize that there are costs for decades, maybe, and also recognize that even when this group reach sort of almost comparable employment levels, we, depending on all policies, we can also expect that they represent a higher pressure on redistribution if we are consistent in terms of ambitions in combating inequalities. And we also know very little about the exit patterns of not only labor migrants but also refugees. So I think that there are some uncertainties that we need to recognize, and we should analyze more in order to assess sort of the economic aspects of asylum migration. I also think that the integration issues are not only about labor market integration, but also about integration in other spheres of society, in civil society, in politics, and that here I would argue that we see a greater signs of a political crisis coming from this higher level of refugee migration that we've seen, not only associated with 2015 but also earlier. And I think it asks questions about how to look at the integration aspect, not also from the majoritarian society, and where there's a lot of political discussion around who are we. And if you start to ask questions about who are we, then you tend to be defining identities in an exclusionary fashion. And I think we should at least take time to reflect on what the consequences are of asking different questions, such as how do we live together? And there's some interesting work around that by Canadian sociologist Keith Banting, together with the philosopher Will Kimlicka. And I think if we want to analyze the politics of this, we need to do our homework also there. I think it's clear that the Geneva Convention, the regime for managing, what we call in political everyday speech, refugees. I mean, it's important, as you do, to make the distinction between displaced persons who are potential refugees or reaching refugee status and will eventually become asylum seekers, and that this is while this group is very good, it's also sort of overflooded by other types of migrants with other main reasons for leaving and seeking asylum, even if these conditions that they are leaving are deplorable and understandable, that they seek progress in their life by moving to other parts of the world. So on the other hand, while this asylum regime or Geneva Convention is working less well because of this fact that people end up in this system despite the lack of the kind of reasons that you need for being accepted as a refugee. I think there's a problematic discussion today, not only in Europe but also elsewhere, of sort of abandoning the Geneva Convention altogether, because there is no functioning system to replace it. And I think what you pointed to also very interesting, that one should complement the right to seek asylum with a better system of managing asylum applications overseas, because this whole system is used by those who seek economic gains to smuggle people. And if we can sort of establish a system that makes it possible for people to get refugee status without engaging in smuggling and spending not only money but also perhaps their lives as a consequence. But I also think that we need to have other, and this is mentioned in the report, other legal ways to get to Europe or the rich part of the world as labor migrants. And I think the Swedish system of having a corridor to be able to come here as a labor migrant is a good example also for Europe, because it's been manageable. It's been subject to critique and re-regulation, but it's actually working in ways that could it be upscaled? It could provide also those who use the Geneva Convention to find other ways of reaching opportunities on the European labour market. But regardless of this, and this may be in sort of contrast to some of the other claims, we at Delmi have spent some time and energy to explore different opportunities of maybe not burden sharing but responsibility sharing. And I think that the big challenge for your point here about having a pan-European or European level mechanism for this is political. The economic reasons are clear, but it's a political sort of stalemate that have dominated this area. So what I would argue is an alternative is actually to take responsibility sharing serious, and maybe not dream of solving this issue altogether, but with a stepwise reform work enter into another way of dealing with this refugee issue, namely in engaging in mutual cooperation, and where we should recognize then that there are different views on maybe the system as a public good, but also that there are different views about the sort of political and social costs of having migrants, and we see that a number of countries in Europe are simply don't want people from other parts of the world, and if that is so, then there are different ways of sharing the responsibility in terms of contributing to the costs for those countries who take this responsibility. And I think this responsibility sharing can be done both in the Middle East and in other conflict areas, and in part of what we're dealing with those who have already come to Europe. Finally, I would like to emphasize that we need to also rethink how we deal with this issue in terms of not only dealing with the symptoms but also the root causes. And if we have a time frame for the demographic pressure on migration from Africa of decades to come, then we should engage in long-term investment in that continent. Thank you very much.
Room for one audience question, if there is any. Yes, Assar. Please wait for the microphone and present yourself, please.
Assar Lindbäck, I'm at Stockholm University. Suppose that it would turn out to be feasible to have a centralized allocation mechanism among countries, but how can you prevent people from adjusting afterwards themselves to move to other countries? Are you going to allocate the stock of people or just the yearly flows? It must be a problem here.
Indeed, and with the open borders in the Schengen area, it's but there might be other ways of regulating this in a contractual fashion or otherwise. But it's certainly a constraint in terms of directing this from a European level, because once you have at least reached the status of a European citizen, then you're free to move. But there's a period then before you enter the status of a European citizen, then there might be possible ways of regulating this. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And welcome up Daniel Sjöberg. And another applause.
Voila. Can you hear me? Perfect. So, hello, good morning. My name is Daniel Sjöberg. I'm the political advisor of Cecilia Wikström from Liberalerna. Normally, Cecilia would be the one standing here, but since she's in China today, you guys are stuck with me. So, I'm going to speak a little bit about the work that we've been doing in the European Parliament over the last few years and in the European institutions, and then towards the end, focus a little bit on what the way forwards could be. So, after the start of the crisis, the European Commission came forward with seven different proposals to reform the entirety of the European asylum system. We normally only speak about the Dublin regulation, but there's actually a package of 7 proposals, 5 of which are actually almost finalized by the co-legislators, so by Parliament and the Council. So, a lot of work has been done and a lot of progress has been made. The 2 big ones that remain is the Asylum Procedures Regulation, where we hope to start negotiations towards the end of the year, if the Council can have a mandate, and obviously the elephant in the room, the Dublin Regulation, which for the moment is quite stuck in the Council. The Dublin Regulation was actually amended already back in 2013. It's gone through a number of revisions, but it's clear that it doesn't work. The regulation's purpose is to determine which member state is responsible for assessing the claim of an asylum seeker that has reached Europe. Now, the problem with the reforms is that there aren't that many ways to do that. So finding a way that is amenable to everyone is pretty hard. Before we go through to the actual reforms, it's also important to say a few words on what Dublin actually is. There's a misconception that Dublin is only the rule of first entry. That's actually the last hierarchy rule of the Dublin regulation. That's the fallback rule when none of the other rules in Dublin can be applied, such as family unity, if the person has come to the nation on a visa, and all of these things. Now, not even the first entry criteria is very used in Dublin, which is also historically has been a problem. So if you look at countries like Sweden or Germany, where very few of the people that reach our countries have not transited through another country, you still have close to single-digit statistics on actual Dublin returns. So even historically, before the crisis, it was very clear that Dublin didn't work, and that the first entry criteria rule didn't work. So what have we had? We have sort of de facto a system where we've had very limited registration of asylum seekers in the frontline states, or in any other state for that matter, which has resulted in a sort of a free choice model for asylum seekers, where they can go to the country in Europe that they most like to apply for asylum in. So for us, we clearly needed a much better system after the crisis. We wanted an orderly and controlled system. We wanted registration immediately at the borders. We wanted a quick responsibility determination that determined which member state is responsible for that particular person. We wanted to stop secondary movements. And we wanted to have some form of incentives for the asylum seekers to cooperate with the authorities. Now, these are very big targets. So in order to try to find ways forward, we set out a pretty big work. We created a consultative forum of NGOs, which included some 35 people that we consulted with very regularly. We had over 100 bilateral meetings with member states, from prime ministers into ministers of interior to ambassadors and others. We had stakeholder consultations in 7 or 8 capitals around Europe. We participated in academic conferences, and most importantly, in the parliament, we had 22 formal political negotiation rounds. Normally on legislation in the parliament, you'd have 3 to 4 rounds of negotiations before you finalize. On this one, we had 22, which is, I'd say, unprecedented. And the idea behind this was that we wanted a solid, practically workable proposal with a broad political support. We didn't want to just do something to have a paper to show that we did something. We wanted something that could actually work, and where we could show Europe that a broad majority of elected European politicians could actually support it. In November of last year, we had a vote on this proposal in Parliament, and we got a 2/3 majority. It included the 5 big political groups, from the left to the right, representing members from almost every member state, about 200 political parties from across Europe. It included Polish conservatives, Hungarian social democrats, former interior minister of Sarkozy, and even Mr. Salvini, who was at the time a member of the European Parliament, abstained, together with his Lega Nord colleagues. And the Lega Nord usually never votes in favor of anything. They vote against most stuff, but on this, they recognized that it was good enough to sort of abstain at least. So what was the end result of our proposals on policy? We wanted to have registration in the first member state, very clearly set out, and we got it. We introduced a sort of a filter in the system that has as a function to try to separate very clear cases of economic migrants that would remain in the first state of entry, whilst every case that was more complicated and needed more assessment would be allocated to the rest, fairly between European states. In essence, the first country of entry principle was replaced as the fallback criteria by the allocation model that sort of fairly allocates refugees across member states. We included better and faster family unity procedures to make sure that people with family in a specific member state can go there. And we included clear incentives for applicants to actually cooperate with the authorities. Now, there are a couple of very important practical considerations here that sort of often get lost in the debate. And one of them is what we refer to as front-loading of the system. You can't put too many procedures in the first member state of entry. For the simple, too many procedures that require too much time. At the height of the crisis, Greece saw 10,000 arrivals per day. If you have that for a substantial period of time, and you have procedures in Greece that take months, the system will collapse. And this is something that the policymakers need to sort of have in mind when they're designing the system. So you need to relatively quickly get people out of the entry points and distribute them. At the same time, we don't want to distribute everyone, because some of the people that come clearly have very weak cases, and then it's better that they stay closer to the entry point and that they can be returned. The second thing we were looking very carefully at is there are loads of loopholes in the current Dublin regulation that allow for secondary migration. And Assa raised the issue here as well, and how can you keep the people from moving? Well, the current Dublin regulation essentially encourages it, because there are rules that say that if you stay under the radar for a while, then you can pop up anywhere and reapply there. If you remove that rule, you remove essentially an incentive to do that. So there are lots of stuff that you can do with the legislation that sort of makes it less interesting to do secondary movements. And yeah. So going forward, as you all know, probably, we have some problems with the member states, to say the least. The problem from our perspective is that the European Council took, from the very early start on this, a position where they tried to find a unanimity position. Now, the problem is they don't need a unanimous position. They need a position with qualified majority, just as we needed a position with a simple majority. They need to unite a large number of member states behind a common position, but they try to unite everyone. And when you have Hungary in the room, that becomes very hard. So in practice, not a single presidency until the Bulgarian presidency in the spring had actually worked on a practical proposal of what the member states thought that Dublin could look like, which was a huge problem. Now, the Bulgarians almost managed to squeeze through a proposal that wasn't, in my view, as good as the Parliament one, but that was at least sort of a basis for discussion. Now, unfortunately, since then, and since that failed in June, member states are focusing more on externalization. And especially the Austrian presidency is focusing more on externalization. So trying to deal with asylum claims outside of Europe. From our perspective, and speaking to people that have been working on asylum for the last many decades, this is something that is destined not to work. For a very practical reason, which is that the countries that people want to deal with these asylum seekers instead of Europe, they're not interested. They've never been interested, and they never will be interested, regardless of how much money you try to throw at them. And you can know that simply because they've been saying that very loudly for a number of years. So it's simply not going to work, whether it's with Tunisia or with Morocco or with Albania, that have all declared at the highest political level that they're not interested. So our problem is that whilst political leaders in Europe are still focused on sort of this alternative to dealing with the problem ourselves, there's not enough focus and enough political will to push things in Council. Our view is that once people realize, and that's already started, that this is a non-starter, they will have to come back to the Dublin reforms and to the reforms of the common asylum system, because that is the only possible way forward. And we're not saying that our version of it is the only way forward. That is one contribution. It can look in different ways. But for Europe to sort of hope that somebody else will deal with migration on our behalf, that's not going to happen. So we need to find a system to manage this in a sensible way. And I'll conclude on that. No.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we'll just do one audience questions directly to Daniel, if there is, and then we'll go on to the panel discussion. So do we have a question? Yes? So please introduce yourself.
Elin Jakobsson, Stockholm University. This work on the new asylum procedure regulation and Dublin regulation, etc., has been done during the time that we have had a temporary legislation here in Sweden. Could you say something about when that legislation in Sweden will be renewed, or whatever will happen to it next year? The possibilities to go back to our normal legislation. How has this new EU regulations changed the possibilities and conditions for Swedish regulation?
I wouldn't say they have changed it dramatically. I mean, the main thing, there are some things in the qualifications. We were discussing on temporary. I mean, one of the big topics in Sweden has been on whether to have temporary permits or how long they should be, or permanent residence permits. The deal, or the tentative deal between Council and Commission, leaves it free to member states to decide that. So in that sense, Sweden would be free to choose which path to take. A lot of the other issues will be settled in the asylum procedures regulation, and there we'll have to wait for the negotiations between member states and the European Parliament to see what comes out of that. But for the bigger question on when the temporary law will be renewed, or if it will be renewed, I think we'll have to wait to see what the Swedish government looks like in the coming weeks, and it will be an issue for the Swedish Parliament to decide. It's not for me to say what will happen with that.
Okay, great. We'll take the questions in the panel discussion. Thank you very much for that. And please welcome up Joakim, Uta, and Daniel. So I will first just let you, Uta, comment on the comments. If you have anything to say about the comments to your research and the ongoing work in the European Parliament. And should I turn on your...
Yeah. So thank you very much to both of you. I learned a lot from your comments. So you made a very important point that the cost of the past crisis are not only in terms of economic costs, but there also are political costs. Yes, that's a very important point. That's precisely why a very important reason why indeed we need to find ways to improve the current asylum system. So you have been very skeptical now about the proposal I have made. Of course, as an economist, as an academic, I came up with the ideal solution that asylum claims ideally decisions should be made before these migrants have made it to mainland Europe. This is actually the model that is practiced in Australia. So there is, to some extent, more or less at least. So not sure it's completely true. It's entirely hopeless. I grant that you are the practitioner here and know more about this. And of course, as economists, we are used to optimize under constraints. So if indeed this ideal solution is not possible, we need to come up with other workable solutions.
Okay, so I will just ask a first question, and then we'll open up for audience questions as well. So in your paper, Uta, you have an idea about the tradable quotas, right, among the European countries, so that there should be some kind of fair share distribution to begin with, but then that countries value the public good of refugees or giving a refugee status, for example, differently, and then they could, or have more different marginal costs of integrating refugees. Then they could trade between countries. So could you comment on that issue? And Daniel, is that something that has ever come up in the European Parliament discussions? So Uta, please.
So that's once again something economists start to think about. Let the market decide, or help let's make use of the market to decide where refugees should actually be allocated. Of course, that's also a policy that's incredibly difficult to implement. And even such a policy first requires some agreement of European countries on the initial quota. Yeah, but it has some clear economic... if implemented, such a system would indeed ensure that refugees are located in those countries where the marginal cost of hosting them is lowest.
Daniel?
We've definitely seen the suggestion a few times, and I think it's an interesting proposal. It's not included in the Parliament text, notably for issues of the complexity it has, but it's one of the things I think we would definitely consider if that would be something that could bring sort of skeptical member states along. The problem here is, if you look at it from a non-economic perspective, but from a political perspective, I don't think it's very much likely that the Hungarians would be more interested in the system if they can trade away part of their quotas, because they would still argue that it's unfair that they have to pay money to Germany, for example, for them to take refugees. You also have the problem that a lot of the countries that would want to give away their quotas is where it's relatively cheap to host refugees. And they would be giving away their quotas or trying to then sell their quotas to countries where it's relatively expensive.
In terms of economic costs.
In terms of economic costs. So you'd also have an issue where the Hungarians would think that what the Germans would be asking then of them for taking it, their share of the responsibility would be unreasonable demands from their side. So, and you saw that already. The Commission proposed a system whereby member states could opt out of the relocation and then pay 250,000 euros per non-resettled refugee or non-relocated refugee in that sense. The problem with that was that from different sides, everybody hated that idea. So.
Okay, so let's open up for audience questions. Yes, so we have one here. A microphone, and please introduce yourself.
Just, my name is Michael Sulman, representing the Institute for International Affairs here. Coming to this point of redistribution and redistribution of cost, the budget discussion is on the agenda very much, and the big recipients, Germany and Sweden, have been launching the idea of using the budget negotiations in order to increase the interest, to put it that way, with Hungary and the big recipients of budgetary resources to be more cooperative. What's your view of the situation in that kind?
We're strongly in favour of that, and there is actually a part in the Parliament proposal that says that if you go against the rules of the relocation, so if you refuse to take people even though you have a responsibility under the regulation to do so, there should be a direct link with the regional funds and the structural funds so that they are diminished. That would have to be elaborated legislatively how that would be done, but we're strongly in favour of it. There are other governments as well. The French government has signalled clearly that they're behind this idea as well. The problem with the budget is that it also requires unanimity. So these discussions on conditionalities, whether it be with migration or conditionalities on fundamental rights and rule of law, are difficult politically to pass through, I think. But it's definitely an interesting discussion.
Thank you. So you had a question earlier?
Yes. No, I was just wondering, time is about to run out now. I mean, you have the European elections, and the last session of the European Parliament is in April. And, what happens if there is no agreement before Christmas or before, how will this? What will happen after with the next Commission and next European Parliament?
It's hard to look into the future, but my guess is we keep working. there's no alternative to doing this. There's been a lot of work done, and as I said, 5 of the 7 files are already more or less concluded. So I don't think anyone wants to throw away the work that's been done on that. The Commission has proposed just in September now some additional works on the asylum agency. There's proposal for 10,000 new border guards in Frontex and a revision of the returns directive as well to make returns work a little bit better than they do for now. And I think these things will join the package, and we'll have to keep working at it and keep trying to find solutions. Maybe hoping that some governments change in council, or that council and the member states sort of come around more to the idea that we need to do something here. Just throwing it away, I don't think would work.
Yes, Joakim?
No, I think these questions are good because we're looking for solutions, but it can actually get worse, and we can get the European Parliament elected where there's a high proportion of the members that don't want to solve issues on the European level, do not want to engage in cooperation around this, but it will rather contribute to cementing positions. And then, I mean, the issue is, how long can the externalization of the whole problem work? It's been working because there's been a deal with Turkey, and it's been working because there's been a lot of money spent in Libya and other African states in order to what's called manage migration, or which is to reduce it to zero. And I think this is, I think, what is deeply worrying in the sense that migration is a natural part of human history. We have seen migration in all periods, and it's really no massive increase in terms of proportion of people moving. It's just that we don't find ways to regulate this and normalize this. And I think this is why it's so important to find ways of not only dealing with refugee migration, but also with labor migration. And there have been some advancements, but I think that it's sort of directed with the Blue Card initiative to high-skilled labor, and what is really, I think, an issue is how to deal with the low-skilled and manage that in a way that can I mean, not be necessarily an economic burden, but actually deal with the kinds of demand for labor that we will see increasing in Europe, not least in the elder care sector and etc.
Yeah, I agree with this. So one problem of the current asylum system really is that there are a lot of, let's call them economic migrants in the system, whose case for asylum is very, very slim. And that is one burden. I don't want to, I'm not sure we should use this word, but that has put some burden on the system. So, and then one way to deal with this actually could be to provide economic migrants with some legal ways of entering the country.
If I can just say, I mean, I do agree with a lot of the stuff that's in the report that I also had the pleasure of reading before, and I do think that you have to say that the EU-Turkey statement, regardless of what you think about it, does seem to work relatively well given the parameters that the member states put forward for that. So in that sense, there can be a case that could be a solution in that particular sense. I think it just has to be nuanced that particular solution that the EU chose between Turkey and Greece is not necessarily applicable to every other solution and can't necessarily be generalized as a response to sort of externalize everything. It's I think it has to be, and I think we have to be careful when discussing Australia as well. The issue does come up every once in a while. The Australians do have a very particular geographic location as well. They have a very particular relationship that allows them essentially to force Nauru and Papua New Guinea to do whatever they tell them, and it's. The human rights conditions in these facilities have rightly been very severely criticized. For those that are interested,
it's a different point.
Yeah.
It's not an argument against the idea in principle, but of course we should make sure.
But there are, for those interested in externalization, there's actually a really interesting report by the Center for European Policy Studies, done by also on commission from Open Society Foundation, that I think you can find on their website.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions on my list, and that might be all we have time for. So first we have Jon Hassler and then Marcus Jenti, both over here. We'll see if we have time for more. So please introduce yourself.
Jon Hassler, Stockholm University Institute, IIES. So to me it seems kind of completely hopeless to be able to force some of the countries to participate in a system like that, even if they only have to pay for it. So why don't we go back to the theory of optimal public good provision, which says that you should provide the public good, the amount of public good provided should be based on summing the individual valuations of the public good. And then a fair burden sharing is that you pay as much as you value it. And then under this theory, if Hungary and Poland don't think there is any value in taking refugees, which seems to be the case, then they shouldn't pay either. So that's kind of should be the basis of a sound system, that you try to find true valuations in the countries, sum up these, and then contribute according to these valuations. So it would be, in a sense, like a two-speed Europe, which we have done in other areas too, with the euro, with Schengen, and so on.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point. And yes, when we decide what this initial allocation should be, then we indeed should take into account what's the individual value of each country of this public good. Yes, so maybe the starting position everybody could agree on would be very few asylum seekers allocated to countries like Hungary and Poland.
Yes.
Yeah, but and what if there are very low evaluations overall in Europe? What to do? Sink them in the Mediterranean, or shoot down those who come to Europe?
In a democracy, they will have to try to convince people that we should do this. But we cannot kind of do something that
you need it.
Should propagate for it. Actually.
But I think the problem that Joakim is coming to is that the constraint we have is every member state, including Hungary and Poland, have signed the Geneva Convention. They've signed an international legal order that says that if you have certain protection needs, you should have protection. So that's the sort of the overall framework. It's not a pick and choose where you can say we want to help, and because then you have to get rid of the convention. And then I agree with Joakim that then we're on a very dangerous slippery slope.
But we can still try to make compromises.
No, of course.
By not allocating refugees just based on population size.
No, I completely agree on that as well. But I think that there's just a very simple political problem. And it's for those... Can I just...
Okay.
Very quickly. If you're in Germany and you're the Chancellor Merkel, you have the AfD, and you have to explain to your voters why Germany is taking a lot of people while Hungary gets to not take anyone, or why other countries do not get to take anyone, and you're then going to be faced with opposition politicians that say, well, if they can't take anyone, why don't we also do the same? Why do we not just drop our quotas to zero? If everyone can drop their quotas.
Now we have time for a short question from Marcus Jenti and some short answers before we round up.
This is to Uta Schönberg. One of the problems with figuring out what asylum seekers and refugees are doing in European countries is that they're not part of the population statistics, so they tend not to be included in labor force surveys and so on, while they are seeking, while they're in refugee centers and so on. But do you know, is there comparative work on, first of all, how countries, the extent to which countries start such things as language training and skill upgrading of the migrant before they enter the population statistics, and also about figuring out their activities while they are outside of population statistics, and are there kind of good and bad examples of this across European countries?
Oh, we need much more work on exactly this issue to understand which programs really work and which programs do not work. The evidence that is out there to date certainly points to, yes, these active programs, language courses, help refugees in the labor market.
Okay, so we're quite on time. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome up Mikael to give some finishing words, and then that's it.
Yes, thank you, Agneta. And also a big thank you to Uta Schönberg, Joakim Palme, and Daniel Sjöberg for sharing your research, thoughts, and perspective on this interesting subject. I also would like to thank you in the audience for coming here and asking questions and discussions. Our next IIES SNS International Policy Talk will be held in December when the Belgian economist Marianne Bertrand comes here to talk about her research about wage differences between the sexes on the labor market. So now you are welcome to continue the discussion outside and have a cup of coffee. So bye and thank you for today.